Good afternoon. My name is Philip Assis, and I am the Deputy Cultural Attaché at the US Embassy in Islamabad. It is absolutely my pleasure to welcome you to the inauguration of our virtual exhibit, Civil Rights Then and Now. A huge thank you to our designer, Mr. Ali, who, even though we could not exhibit these photos in a physical gallery, created a truly lifelike virtual gallery that captures the spirit of this event and the significance of the civil rights movement for the United States and Pakistan. Today's inauguration is part of a month-long celebration of Black History Month, which takes its roots back to 1926 as a time to recognize the full range of contributions of African Americans to the wider American society. Black history is an essential part of American history, as this exhibit will help demonstrate. Following our viewing of the exhibit, we will have a presentation on the civil rights movement, then and now, and a chance for you to ask any questions you may have. Thank you for joining us today, and I am now pleased to inaugurate the virtual exhibit, Civil Rights Then and Now. Give me one moment just to share my screen with you.
The Civil Rights Movement, Then and Now.
In this exhibition, The Civil Rights Movement, Then and Now, images from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s are juxtaposed with today's movement. Students, athletes, politicians, activists, and Americans from all backgrounds.
My apologies. My apologies. There is a sound that goes with this, and since we've just begun, I'm going to reload the exhibit so that we can get the sound, hopefully. And I'm sure you're all familiar with with some of the technical challenges that we've had throughout the COVID period. So I'll try this one more time, and hopefully that will do the trick. So thank you for your patience. Okay, let's try this one more time. All right. We don't have the sound. I'll just let it go regardless. So we'll start this again. Yeah.
The Civil Rights Movement, Then and Now.
In this exhibition, The Civil Rights Movement, Then and Now, images from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s are juxtaposed with today's movement. Students, athletes, politicians, activists, and Americans from all backgrounds continue to fight for equal rights, showing us through their actions that it is the responsibility of each of us to stand up and demand equality for all. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., letter from Birmingham Jail, April 16, 1963. In 1965, civil rights leaders marched from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to demand equality.
In 2015, President Obama joined thousands of Americans in Selma to honor the sacrifice and bravery of those who bled there in 1965. The civil rights movement in the United States was a struggle for social justice that took place during the 1950s and 1960s by Black Americans and their allies to end racial discrimination and legal segregation. This movement which had its roots in the centuries-long efforts of enslaved Africans and their descendants to resist racial oppression
The
and
green
abolish
check
the institution
spots.
of slavery, continues to present day as many are still fighting to ensure equal rights for all Americans.
Marchers filled the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, 1965.
Marchers filled the streets in Washington, D.C., December 2014.
After the Civil War, which was fought in large part over the economics of slavery, the government amended the Constitution to include the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which emancipated the slaves and granted them certain constitutional rights of citizenship. Despite these advances, Black Americans were still deprived of their civil and political rights. Police drag away a civil rights protester at the Republican National Convention, Miami, August 1968.
A single woman stands in the roadway to protest excessive police force against the city's black residents. Baton Rouge, July 2016. In the early 1950s, fed up with the continued prejudice and violence against them, Black Americans mobilized and began an unprecedented fight for equality through non-violent mass protests and demonstrations against racial segregation and discrimination.
Members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a national civil rights organization founded in 1960, protest segregation.
Black Lives Matter founders protest racism and police shootings of black people, 2015.
This movement inspired and merged with other social movements, mobilizing Americans from all walks of life to demand full rights and acceptance in American society. This includes other ethnic minorities such as American Indians, Asians, and Latinx, as well as women and sexual minorities. Sanitation workers strike, Memphis, Tennessee, March 28, 1968.
A woman marches to the White House, June 13, 2020. While some may think that the civil rights movement is part of the distant past, the killings of young black men and women, such as Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery over the last decade have garnered renewed attention and sparked outcries over the continued injustices and violence that Black Americans in the United States still face.
Civil rights marchers in Mississippi tear gassed by police, June 23, 1966.
Tear gas rains down on a woman kneeling in the street during a demonstration over the killing of Michael Brown by a police officer. Ferguson, Missouri, August 17, 2014.
Contemporary movements such as Black Lives Matter, Fair Fight, and Color of Change emerged in response to police brutality, unequal voting rights, and racial inequalities in access to resources. They remind us that the struggle for social justice and civil rights remains as relevant and urgent today as it did in the 1950s and 60s. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, gold and bronze medalists in the 200-meter run at the 1968 Olympic Games, raised their fists in protest of the unfair treatment of blacks in the United States. Mexico City, 1968.
Colin Kaepernick and 49ers teammates Eli Harold and Eric Reed kneel in protest during the playing of the US national anthem, October 6, 2016. Nobody is free until everybody is free. Fannie Lou Hamer, excerpt from a speech delivered at the founding of the National Women's Political Caucus, Washington, D.C., July 10, 1971.
Thank you for visiting the US Embassy's virtual exhibit, Civil Rights Then and Now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. You just give me 1 second here. Thank you for viewing our virtual exhibits. And now it is my pleasure to turn the table and turn the floor over to my colleague, Mr. David Borough. David Borough is a third tour officer serving in the political economic section of the US Embassy in Islamabad. He previously served in Brazil and Cabo Verde, which is a small island nation off the coast of Africa. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, he worked as a political risk analyst and as a political campaign consultant. His spouse is on my team and serves as an eligible family member in the embassy's public affairs section. So please join me in welcoming David Morrow.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Philip. It's really great to have the opportunity to be here with you all this afternoon. So thanks to those who are joining us on the live, and thanks to Philip and my other public affairs colleagues for including me in this. It's a real honor, and I'm really pleased to be here with everybody today. The powerful presentation we just watched, and I think it was really, really well done with the juxtaposing images from the era of the civil rights movement alongside more contemporary ones from very recent years. Really was a quite vivid reminder that many of the battles that we thought to have won in the 1960s and the past generations are actually, to a large extent, still being fought today. I don't want to say that nothing's gotten better. There's no doubt that so much has changed for the better, but a lot of these root issues still remain unaddressed, and that's kind of what I'd like to discuss a little bit more today, after it already was being touched on during the presentation. I was living in Washington, D.C. In the summer of 2020, and at that time it seemed like all the frustrations about racial inequities, whether in the way the police treat Black people, the way all too many states restrict the ability of Black people to vote, or a long list of other injustices, had finally come to a boiling point. You probably remember it. It was widely covered in the news and the international media when the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis led to protests, discussions within communities, and calls for reform that we really hadn't seen for years, certainly not in my lifetime, and maybe ever. It seemed like at that point, back in the summer of 2020, there would be a breakthrough, that serious change, despite all the political forces pushing against it, was finally inevitable. And in some ways, there really was a breakthrough. I certainly don't want to minimize the reforms and changes that have come out of that movement a few years ago. And we really do need to salute the work of activists and their allies in government that they did in 2020 and following the election later that year. That was really vitally important and led to real life changes in people's lives, especially in things like policing and sentencing that have had dramatic positive effects in real people's lives. But at the same time, it's really important to say that and to reaffirm that we still have a long way to go. And while we can and should and really must celebrate and commemorate the past, the awe-inspiring sacrifices so many Americans have made and the courage so many have shown, we still must also grapple with a difficult and uncomfortable question. Why do we still have so far to go? nearly 60 years after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed by Congress in 1964 and 1965, and then signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, there is still not a full and complete political consensus in our country to build upon the fundamental ideas that those pieces of legislation represented. There isn't. And for me personally, that's deeply disturbing. But also, however, it's undeniably true. So Black History Month should be about remembering the countless contributions of Black people to American history, to American culture, to American society, to American politics, to American business. But it also can and should be about acknowledging the very real challenges Black people continue to face in today's America. And for those of us who are American, it's about resolving to do something to reduce those challenges and remove those obstacles, not just during this month of February for Black History Month, but every day of the year. And while there are a lot of issues we could discuss, I would like to take a few more brief minutes to discuss an issue that, even after so many decades, remains in the news and still, to some extent, still remains controversial: voting rights. When I was a kid, I learned in school that the voting rights of 1965 was one of the civil rights movement's crowning achievements. It ensured discriminatory practices that were aimed at diminishing the power of Black people and Black voters, really, like poll taxes, literacy tests, drawing districts to reduce Black voters' ability to choose who was representing them in Congress or their state legislators, would be against federal law. I'm from Texas, a state that was part of the Confederacy and had discriminatory Jim Crow laws during much of the early first half of the 20th century that effectively made it an apartheid state. It's a sad and shameful part of my state's history, of our country's history, that we're still struggling to reckon with to this day, really. But as a young student in Texas, despite that shameful side of the history, I could also take pride in the fact that it was a Texan, who I mentioned earlier, President Lyndon Johnson, who signed both the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and also the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. And also, as a Texan, we were proud that the only senator from any of the 11 former Confederate states to vote for either of those pieces of legislation was a Texan, Senator Ralph Yarborough. So, Black Americans were still denied full citizenship and voting rights until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's a long time, a full century after the Civil War ended, and the Emancipation Proclamation, and a few years earlier had freed the slaves in America. And all American women were denied the right to vote until just over 100 years ago still. But as much as we'd like to think that those battles are in the past and universal suffrage is not remotely controversial these days, what we can observe even to this very day points to, sadly really, points to different conclusions. There are obstacles to vote, often affecting Black Americans more than others. And in too many states, those obstacles seem to be getting bigger, not smaller. That's why President Joe Biden and others are now advocating for the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. These pieces of legislation, according to their advocates, will restore the strength of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as unfortunately some of those bills' provisions have been left to expire in recent years, as the US Congress has not voted to extend all of them. So, nearly 60 years later, in some ways, it's sad to say, in some ways, we really have gone backwards on voting rights. John Lewis began his career as a civil rights activist in the 1960s. He was beaten by police while protesting for voting rights, and then he ended his career as one of the most respected members of Congress in American history. And the contested fight for fair and equal voting rights for Black Americans spanned really the entirety of his 6-decade career. As disheartening as that may be, there are still a lot of reasons to be optimistic, and I want to focus on that. We've seen a new generation of activists emerge in the last few years, many of whom really are inspired by John Lewis and his generation of civil rights activists, And this new generation is committed to doing the hard work in their communities and on the ground, whether protest, whether demanding change in Congress or their state legislatures, to ultimately deliver real lasting change. Even after all these years and all the battles, some won, some lost, positive change on issues such as voting rights and really broader civil rights remains difficult. These issues, even if they seem like fundamental basic human rights to many of us, very much remain contested issues. And there's just no getting around that. But despite all this, I really don't want my message to be interpreted as pessimistic. The story of civil rights for Black Americans has never been simple. Wins, even big victories, big wins like the Civil Rights Act, like the Voting Rights Act, aren't absolute forever victories, unless we collectively, as all Americans, continue to put in the hard work to help institutionalize those victories, as there remains sadly still some in our country who are working to undermine those victories of the past. And even defeats and setbacks can inspire new waves of activists who just might finally deliver profound, lasting change in the near future. I'd like to end with a reference to a speech President Biden made last month in Atlanta, Georgia, which he rightly described as the cradle of civil rights, given its status as the birthplace of Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and so many other civil rights leaders. While discussing the current debate over voting rights legislation, President Biden said, "The world is watching. The majority of the world's leaders, the good and bad ones, adversaries and allies alike, they're watching American democracy and seeing whether we can meet this moment." And that's not hyperbole. I agree with the president. It really isn't hyperbole. And as Americans, we're challenged to ensure voting rights for Black Americans and all Americans are fully protected to provide a strong democratic example for the world. We shouldn't allow any country to be able to use our failings on voting rights as an excuse to suppress their own citizens' rights to vote. So thanks for listening to me, and thanks for celebrating Black History Month. As the presentation showed, let's all remember that it's not just about history. Many of these challenges continue to this day, and it's up to all of us to work together to do our best to overcome them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. That was a wonderful compliment to the exhibit and heartfelt. We truly appreciate you joining us today to give this presentation. Very much appreciated. We have time for some questions from the audience, and I believe we already have some entered, but if you would like to submit a question yourself, please do so in the chat box. So David, the first question that's come in for you is, how should we balance honoring the progress made over the past decades and acknowledging that there is still a long ways to go?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Philip. And it's a tough one too. I think, talking about issues in the same way that as the presentation did, just showing that in very real, concrete ways, we have made a lot of progress that we should be proud of, that we should celebrate, that make things possible in today's America that wasn't possible certainly in the 1960s, but also perhaps even more recently. We need to acknowledge that. We need to celebrate that. But it's also really important to keep reminding ourselves, reminding audiences within the country and internationally that our work is not over, and there's still a lot of things that we need to do. And I think, especially as you see, like the Black Lives Matter movement and other activist groups and other movements sprouting up and gaining support in the United States, there's no danger of us forgetting that we still have a lot of work to do, and it's something that's going to continue moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You touched on this in your presentation about the new generation of activists, but this question is, what is the current civil rights movement, and related to that, what groups are fighting for civil rights in the US today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's almost too many to name. I mean, certainly in 2020, really before that, if you go back, I guess it was 2014, um, after police misconduct, police shootings in Ferguson, Missouri, when Black Lives Matter really came on the scene, but it gained more. Became more famous and more widely known in 2020, and attracted a lot of attention from not just government officials, but celebrities, and it really became a household name that has a lot of widespread respect in the United States. But I don't think, by no means is this movement, the larger movement, limited to BLM. There's a lot of other smaller groups, whether they're based in certain geographic areas, certain states, certain communities, that are doing really, really important work. And then you also have some historical groups that that have been around for maybe a century or more, like the NAACP, that also are playing an important role. Maybe less on the ground activism, but trying to make the case for change in Congress or with other government officials. So I think it's like
Yeah,
a very multi-pronged. There's just a lot of different groups, a lot of different activists, and a lot of different forms of energy going into this these days.
yeah, yeah. Also, a new crop of African American political leaders too, like Stacey Abrams and Cory Booker. That
Totally.
are
That's
really,
yeah, that's definitely true.
yeah, yeah. Another question is, do you think that civil rights leaders from the 1960s would be surprised or not that voting rights remains a controversial issue for some in 2022?
Oh man, I think they would certainly be disappointed. I think that most of our civil rights leaders, though, had a very clear-eyed view of I don't know, like of what America is and isn't, and so I think they would be maybe encouraged to see a lot of the progress we've made. I think they would celebrate a lot of things that a lot of specific instances of progress that we've made. But I don't think they'd be that shocked, to be honest. I think that even back then, there was an acknowledgement that this would be like the work wasn't going to stop just one day. It would be a continued process.
Yeah,
And so, they would see, the election of President Obama, they would celebrate that. They would celebrate, as you said, more and more African Americans being elected to the Senate and to higher places of elected office. But yeah, sure, if they see that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, certain provisions of that have been left to expire, yeah, it's super disappointing. But I think they would say, it's just part of the ongoing struggle, and yeah, there's still more work to do, as we said.
yeah, yeah. And that relates to another question from the audience. How has the civil rights movement changed over time? Obviously, in the 1960s, it was very focused on voter rights, but there are other issues at play as well, and the movement has evolved. How would you characterize its evolution over time?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm certainly not by any means like an expert on this, but from my perspective, um, certainly in the wake of George Floyd, there was a focus on policing and police misconduct, and officer shootings and things like that. But I think it really quickly became a lot broader based, bringing in Voting Rights Act, which I still think, I mean, you've seen so many civil rights leaders, so many Black political leaders really campaigning hard for voting rights legislation, even in the last few months, last few weeks. So I think it's a really broad-based movement, and it's too simple to say that it's focused on one thing, because like the demands of the civil rights movement in the United States today are really diverse. Even like things like equal pay are serious demands, even though so yeah, I think I'm not the one to characterize it really, but I think there's just a lot of different demands that they have.
Yeah, yeah, good. Do you think that the civil rights movement changed race relations in in the United States?
Um, I think it did, but I
Mhm.
think it's a tough question. I think it did, but I think there's also, to a certain extent, a backlash to the success of the civil rights movement. And I think that is, uh, you've seen kind of a similar backlash in some ways when there's been significant progress made, whether that be, backlash to civil rights going back to the mid 60s, then people kind of changing their voting behavior, or a backlash to the election of President Obama after he left his term, or after he finished his 2 terms. So I think, civil rights movement, civil rights activists, they have changed things for a lot of people, but there's still a sizable minority in the U.S. that is resistant to that, and will continue to kind of push back and have backlash. Hopefully that changes as we move kind of further and further along with the new generation. But I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, okay, we have just two more questions. One is how are today's protests different from those in the past, or are they different?
Man, that's a good question. I I don't know. I think, like, as the presentation really showed, if you look at the pictures of Martin Luther King's March on Washington from 1963, and maybe compare it to stuff that was even happening last year or the year before, I don't know. They're not all that different to me. I mean, certainly there are differences. We don't have these days, it seems like, um, so many like recognizable figures involved like we did in the 60s, maybe, where there was like real, I don't know, like well-known individuals who were central to those movements. This, I think you could maybe call BLM and other similar groups these days are more um, decentralized, and have leaders in different states, different communities, like all around the country, maybe. So that part might be different. I think, going back to your point about the elected officials now, you probably have more political leaders who are openly participating, in some cases even leading these protests. So that's a change. When back in the 60s, it was more of a, they were trying to really agitate against all the political parties to get support. Now, they have much more support, it seems like, from certain parties.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, I think if you look at those pictures, one's black and white and one's in color, but a lot of the similarities are there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly the way that protests are organized has changed with the advent of social media in particular, and just the political organization structure
No,
has
that's
changed.
a really great point. Yeah. And that's made it a lot easier, um,
Mhm.
whether
Also,
sorry, go ahead.
I mean, it's also given an avenue for the backlash.
Yeah, well, that's true too. And like, it was still, I think it was a cell phone video or something of George Floyd's murder that kind of sparked a lot of this stuff
Mhm.
2 years ago. And that obviously, even, I don't know, like 15 years ago, maybe no one would have been on hand with a video camera to record that. So who knows what happens? But yeah, that's a really good point, as far as social media being used to organize these protests.
Yeah, good point. Looks like the last question we have is kind of a fun one. Why is it that music has helped fuel so many social justice movements led by Black Americans? Not just by Black Americans, but in particular, I would say.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think like the music's really good. Like the music we had in this presentation was great. I think even in, it's all been during COVID in the last few years, but I think there's been a lot of good, um, great music that's come out of, frustrations with the state of civil rights and race relations in the US in the last couple of years. But I think a lot of it just kind of speaks to the centrality of um, Black musicians and Black artists to American culture. Something else I know you guys are talking about during Black History Month. And it's not like it's all protest-based art, but yeah, like American music, American art, American literature. Black Americans play such like a central role in all of that. So it's not really to me a surprise that these movements have led to music in that way.
Yeah. Well, speaking as a musician myself, I can say that music is the language of the soul, and I mean, that's a cliche to say, but it's true. It speaks to people in a way that beyond what words can. And I think it's often used as a way to mobilize and bond people together in a language that everyone can relate to. So I know music has been very central to the civil rights movement throughout history, both to get the messages across and also to sort of speak to the emotions of in a way that words alone cannot.
I fully agree, despite being an untalented musician, and I can fully vouch for your musical talent.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. Do you have time for one more question? Came in as we were speaking. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
All right. Great. Okay. Despite the ongoing discussion on this issue and awareness amongst Americans, why have there not been substantial gains achieved in a country like America?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do think, I think we got to separate it, because there really have been substantial gains at the same time as we keep coming back to the point that there's still a lot of ways to go, and a lot of progress still to be made. So I think by any measure there have been substantial gains. Why we haven't, gotten as far as we would like to go, it's a tough question, and I think that kind of gets back to some of these uncomfortable truths or inconvenient truths that I discussed a little bit earlier. America's a big, diverse, complicated country. To change America, whether like through laws is very difficult because of some of our institutions like the Senate, and things like that, but also just to change American culture, to change the way people think is tough. But at the same time, I mean, even from when I was younger, growing up in Texas, like to say we haven't made substantial gains is inaccurate. So I think we can celebrate the substantial gains that we've made, recognize that we really have made substantial gains, and still say, look, despite what we've done, there's still a long way to go, and we need to do X, Y, Z, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But yeah, I think the good and bad thing about our country is it's always kind of reinventing itself, and it's always like an ongoing process. So I think in a couple decades or a couple years, maybe even, we'll have more gains to celebrate. But I don't think we'll ever get to that like perfect spot. But yeah, very good and difficult question to end on.
Yeah, that is an excellent point to end on. We've come a long ways. We have a long ways to go, and we are constantly in a work in progress. So I would like to thank you again for joining us. That was an excellent presentation. We truly appreciate your insights and your ability to respond to the wide range of questions that have come in. And I would like to thank you, our audience members, for joining us today. This is, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the key events of our Black History Month celebrations. We've had quite a few others as well. And we're always very pleased to have a role in connecting the American and Pakistani people through shared histories and experiences, and in this case, the issue of civil rights, which is a universal issue that impacts the United States and Pakistan and countries all over the world. So once again, thank you, David. Thank you to the entire team behind the exhibition and the presentation today. And I wish you all the best. And Allah Hafiz. Good afternoon.